Part two of our expert discussion from Dr. Jeffries is titled The History. While we listen to this portion of the talk, listen for the big picture. Listen to how what is shared fits into the bigger picture.
Hello again. I'm Hasan Kwame Jeffries, and this is Confronting Hard History, Part 2, The History. We ended Part 1 talking about where to begin. Now we need to turn to our attention to when to begin. When to begin talking about race and racism in historical context. Well, it's important that we begin in 1619, 401 years ago, when the first Africans bound in chains were brought to British North America. And it's important to begin in 1619 because too often when we talk about the institution of slavery, we talk about it as America's original sin, as though it was unfortunate, but just one aspect of a larger and greater experience. The fact is, slavery wasn't just America's original sin. Slavery was America's origin. It will and did shape the evolution and trajectory of what would become the United States. And central to slavery in the American experience was the principal justification for it, which was racism. So this means that racism is very much encoded in our national DNA. It isn't something that Americans invented. It was very much something that American colonists inherited, but they built on it. They subscribed to it. When we think about the two strands of DNA in the American historical context, one of those strands is absolutely racism, the other is capitalism, and the two combined give us the institution of slavery. And racism just wasn't a random idea. Racism is very much enshrined in law, starting in the colonial period and evolving ever since. In 1740, South Carolina passed what it called its Negro Slave Act, coming immediately on the heels of a major enslaved rebellion, the Stonewall Rebellion. And in this act, the South Carolina passes a series of laws to govern, to regulate Black behavior. And among the statutes that it passed was one that said that any white person could stop any Black person, whether that Black person was enslaved or free, and question them, demand to know what they are doing, where they're coming from, and where they are going. And if they refused to submit and attempted to resist that white person, then that white person was within the law, was legally empowered to take the life of that Black person without consequence. And the shame of these laws is that they not only reflected a culture, but they reinforced a culture of racial violence, of racial discrimination that does not end when slavery ends. That kind of action, that kind of sense of racial empowerment to stop and to question any Black person for any reason, just because a white person suspects or thinks or feels that that Black person is out of place, has deep roots in the American legal tradition. But racism isn't just enshrined in local law. Racism is very much infused in our founding documents. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to take students from Ohio State to James Madison's Montpelier. And James Madison, of course, was the fourth president of the United States, the father of the Constitution, the architect of the Bill of Rights. But James Madison was also an enslaver. He enslaved more than 100 people over the course of his lifetime, and he never freed a single soul. In fact, Madison was a third generation enslaver. Slavery, keeping people in bondage, was a family pastime, a family business, and Madison inherited that. When I take students to Madison's Montpelier, which is a plantation, but as a plantation, it also is a slave labor camp. We spend some time as soon as we get there in Madison's library, and that's the image that's on the screen now. This is the place where Madison conceived and conceptualized the Bill of Rights, that fundamental, those 10 rights that are enshrined in the Constitution that government ought not infringe upon. But after we spend some time in this place where history happened, we go down to the cellars, the place where enslaved African Americans who managed Madison's household spent most of their time. And I tell my students to place their hands on the brick walls and to feel for the impressions in the face of the brick. And when they find those impressions, they quickly realize that these impressions are actually handprints. They are the handprints of the enslaved people who made the bricks. But they will also realize, and they soon realize, that these handprints are actually too small to be the handprints of adults, because they are the handprints of children. Because on Madison's plantation, it was the children who were tasked with the job of making the bricks for the plantation. So I want our students, and we need our students to understand that the library in which Madison conceives and conceptualizes the Bill of Rights rests on a foundation of bricks made by the children that he enslaved. And Madison didn't have to read Enlightenment thinkers and Greek philosophers to come up with the Bill of Rights. All he had to do was look outside of his window at the children that he was making labor for his comfort and convenience, and think about the rights that he was denying them, the right of freedom of assembly, the right of freedom of speech, the right of justice before due process before the courts. All he had to do was think about all the rights that he was denying the people he was holding in bondage, and then put those down and say these are not to be infringed upon for white folk, for white people, at any time. Otherwise, we will wind up in a position just like those we are holding in bondage. The infusion of racism in the founding documents manifests itself in several ways, including a Fugitive Slave Act empowering, once again, not only all white people, like that South Carolina Act, but all legal authorities to capture any freedom seekers, any African Americans and slave folk who took it upon themselves to escape the horror of slavery, to capture and return them to those who were keeping them in bondage. The Electoral College, rooted firmly in this preference for empowering enslavers by granting them more political power based upon the numbers of people that they enslaved. So racism, so the Constitution itself is not necessarily a racist document. Pieces of paper can't be racist, but that document can be infused with racism because it is infused with the ideas of those who drafted it. It's important for us to acknowledge that racism isn't simply a Southern phenomenon, that racism in American history is a national phenomenon. Too often, we like to pat ourselves on the back here in the great state of Ohio by pointing out that Ohio entered the Union in 1803 as a state that prohibited slavery. But we make the leap from saying that Ohio prohibited slavery to saying that Ohio essentially believed in racial egalitarianism. Well, the truth is Ohioans and white Ohioans believed in white supremacy in much the same way as whites in Virginia and whites in Kentucky. The reason why white Ohioans did not want slavery is because they did not want black people in Ohio, whether they were in bondage or whether they were free. And so it's important that we uh, constantly contextualize and not allow our students to assume that because uh, on the surface, Ohio, the source of their roots was on the right side of history when it came to being for or against slavery, was inherently a racially egalitarian place, a place free of racial discrimination. When we're teaching about slavery, and when we're teaching about the era of freedom, it is so critically important that the entry point be resistance, that we lead with resistance. And this is important because our students uh, lack a real ability to connect with people of color and marginalized folk, oppressed groups. And this includes uh, African Americans who were in bondage. Not too long ago, I had a conversation with a fourth grade teacher in Virginia, and she was complaining about the lack of empathy of her students. She was doing a lesson on the immigration crisis at the border, and she was showing these her students images of kids in cages. We've all seen those images before, and she was troubled by their stoic reaction. And she concluded that this generation of young people just simply lack empathy. And I told her, no, 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 they do not lack empathy. They just simply lack empathy for certain groups of folk. And she said, no, it's impossible. And I gave her a homework assignment. I told her to, when she returned to class, to pull up one of those ASPCA commercials. You know, the ones that we see at 3 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep, that has Sarah McLachlan singing in the background, and a little puppy with no legs and one eye chained up to a pole. I said, show them one of those commercials and see how they react. And sure enough, she did. She pulled up one of those commercials, showed it, and within 20 seconds, the kids are crying and weeping and why and how could this possibly be? And they're ready to lead a revolution and to raise some money, uh, which demonstrated they don't lack empathy. The problem is they have more empathy for animals than they do for children of color, than they do for people of color. And that's not an accident because we as a society condition our children to be empathetic towards animals, giving them stuffed animals, talking about how adorable and lovable and kind we ought to be to dogs and cats when we don't do anything of the sort when it comes to people of color. And so there is an empathy gap that prevents our students from being able to learn this history and being able to identify with the enslaved and not solely the enslaver. And so leading with resistance helps bridge that gap because resistance to oppression is the way in which human beings are able to connect and identify with other groups. If we never talk about resistance, we just talk about the oppression, then our young people, our students, are going to push back against those groups. And like, well, why the heck wouldn't they want to resist? Why the heck wouldn't they resist? If I was in that situation, I would do the same. And so we lead with resistance, and we complicate it, of course. But leading with resistance helps bridge that gap. And here in Ohio, we have the great opportunity, a great entry point, that being the Underground Railroad. Black folk are constantly resisting, and one of the ways they resist is through flight. And of course, the network of activists helping African Americans, enslaved African Americans, escape to freedom runs right through Ohio. So we can use the Underground Railroad as an entry point to talk about resistance in a way that will humanize African Americans, build empathy in our students for marginalized and oppressed groups and people of color, and which in the end will help them identify, again, not just with the enslaver, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, but with the enslaved. When teaching about the history of race and racism, we cannot stop talking about the institution of slavery once slavery ends. because slavery has legacies that stretch into the contemporary moment. On the African American side, the principal legacy is that African Americans will fight for a combination of civil rights and human rights, what I call freedom rights, that they identify as the crux of freedom based upon their experiences in bondage. So we cannot understand what it is that Black folk are fighting for in 1865 and 1965, or even in 2020, without understanding that the origin for these goals, whether they be housing, quality education, personal safety, access to the ballot box, are all rooted in the experiences that they had in slavery. Nobody understood what freedom meant more than those who were living without their freedom and yet in the presence of those who enjoyed their freedom. The enslaved children who were making bricks for the comfort and convenience of James Madison did not need to read any of the books in his library, did not need to read the Bill of Rights to know that freedom of speech, that education were rights that they were being denied, and also rights that they were entitled to as human beings. Part of the legacy of slavery that we have to deal with as well as white supremacy. While we as a nation should be applauded for ending slavery, we also have to acknowledge that we did not end white supremacy when abolition came. The principal justification and rationalization, racism for slavery, continue to serve as the justification for new economic systems designed to exploit African American labor, such as sharecropping, served as the justification for social systems designed to instill a sense of superiority among white folk and inferiority among Black folk, that being Jim Crow. And white Americans in the South and outside the South, here in Ohio, they fight to preserve white supremacy. In 1906, here's a snippet of a headline for the Springfield pogrom, a racial riot, if you will, in which whites descend upon an African American community. And we would see this time and time again during the antebellum era Cincinnati. White workers descend on the Black community there. And so it's important that we acknowledge and recognize and unpack this principal legacy of slavery. We also, as we move into the 20th century, but really when we talk about American history and the African American experience in general, race and racism, it's important that we push back against and move away from this idea of perpetual racial progress. Because the reality is things don't always just get better. That the history of the African American experience, the history of the American experience along the color line is one of opportunities won and opportunities lost. In 1954, when the Supreme Court rules that segregation education is unconstitutional, that is an opportunity won based upon a hard-fought effort, some 30 years of African Americans fighting in the courts to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal decision. But just as this is an opportunity won, that same opportunity is lost as a result of whites pushing back against this court ruling and the court acceding to their demands. In 1955, the Supreme Court rules that there does not provide a timetable for the implementation of its own ruling. And as a result, it would be 10 plus years in the South and far longer in the states of the North before we begin to see any significant movement in terms of desegregation. If we're going to talk about opportunities won and opportunities lost, we also have to teach the contemporary roots of contemporary problems. As for example, talking about housing discrimination and its connection to the wealth gap. Median household wealth for whites is $140,000. Median Black household wealth is $4,000. And the sole explanation for this is a long history of housing discrimination that goes back, especially and particularly to the New Deal, when the federal government in the 1930s created these neighborhood categories based on race, and those neighborhoods that were color-coded red were all Black neighborhoods, and they would not receive federal mortgage support. And therefore, the homes, the housing in Black neighborhoods was never able to appreciate. Black folk were never able, not allowed to move into white neighborhoods, into the suburbs that would then, where the home values would appreciate. And therefore, they were never able to generate in significant ways wealth, because wealth in America is very much tied by the time we get to the early 20th century, mid 20th century, to home ownership. And so this isn't just a function. The wealth gap that we experience today, the segregation that we see in our neighborhoods and is then reflected in our schools, isn't something that is accidental, isn't something that's solely a function of personal prejudice, but it has been created and maintained by policies and practices that were created by the state. It's also critically important that we teach today, that we teach about the war on drugs, which has led to mass incarceration and the response of Black folk to these problems rooted in Black Lives Matter protests. The demands for police reform stem from the fact that mass incarceration doesn't happen without mass arrests. And so often those mass arrests are disproportionately impact African Americans and are driven by an imperative to crack down on nonviolent offenders, very often nonviolent offenders who have violated some drug law. So we can't be afraid to teach today. Our students are demanding that we help them understand today, and they deserve to understand today. And so that is very much part of our task, to connect the present as it relates to race and racism to the past. And the only way that we can help them make sense of the present is if we put it in its proper historical context. Thank you very much.
So after listening to part 2 of our expert discussion, The History, we want to focus on this quote from Dr. Jeffries. Push back against the idea of perpetual racial progress, that things always get better. Think in terms of opportunities won and opportunities lost. In a small group, consider the following question. When thinking about addressing race and racism, where do the opportunities lie within our school and community to make progress?